What am I saying, Cody?
I don't know.
That I'm a failure as a photographer?
I don't know what you're saying. I have no idea.
Neither do I. Alright, let's see. What am I saying?
Hello everyone. Just out scouting for a very specific photo shoot location. This is a follow-up to the mountain biking shoot that I did recently. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out. But during the shoot, I tried doing kind of like a radial blur shot of the mountain biker coming towards me. And after watching the video, I realized there's no chance that I was going to work in that setting. Trying to like hand hold 7200mm lens at a slow shutter speed while trying to match the zoom with the mountain biker coming on like a non-straight pathway. Anyways, that's the whole point of experimental shoots, to learn what works and doesn't work. So I was determined to figure out a way to do it. So we're gonna try it again and try and do it properly. So I'm just looking for a straight pathway. I'm gonna use a tripod, and I'll kind of go over the details once I find a spot. So we found a spot here and a model. So we're gonna give this another go. So part of the issue with the attempt that I did during my last video was trying to do a handheld, and also in a section of the trail that wasn't straight. So the model was kind of going up and down hills. So with a slower shutter speed, even if the radial blur was effective, part of the issue was the model going up and down and ruining the effect, as well as kind of hand holding and just having that natural shake involved. So to try and remedy this, we've got a straight path today. So we're going to try and get Cody here to come straight towards the camera, with very little move on either axis except for forwards and backwards, and then also shooting on a tripod. And part of the other thing that I didn't like about some of the motion blur shots from the last shoot was using lights and them freezing parts of the trees and stuff in the surrounding area. So we're going to try and shoot this natural light without any kind of flash freezing him. And if none of this works, we're still going to take some shots and try and Photoshop it. So one way or another, we'll figure out how to do this. So we've done our first couple test shots, and you can scroll through and see that we're kind of getting the general effect that we're after. We're still not quite timing the zoom properly with Cody's speed, but as you can see, it could be a very cool shot once we grab it. I took a couple clean plates in case this doesn't work out. We'll get a couple with Cody actually frozen riding towards the camera and composite in Photoshop, but this will be a good reference point for how the background should actually look. But we're still going to do a couple more and see if we can actually get this in camera. Here I realized my shutter is probably a little too slow. Just makes it very tough to match the zoom speed properly. So I've upped it a little bit to 1/13 of a second and see if this works out. So a couple more test runs and see how long Cody can last. Looks like it has potential, but the problem is only the exact center of the frame is still somewhat sharp. So the way that Cody was framed is actually more on his chest. So I'm going to try and change the composition a little bit. I don't know if the spot that is going to be relatively frozen is going to be big enough to kind of incorporate his face, but that's kind of the next route that I'm going to try. All right, so this last strategy actually didn't work too bad. The problem is it really limits the composition with having the rider's frame right in the center. So I'll kind of like upload to show you what that looks like. But I think I'm at the point now where I just don't think I'm going to get the shot that I have in my head using this method. So the next approach is to grab some actual sharp frames of Cody driving or riding towards the camera, and then I'll Photoshop it. And I'll film that as well to kind of go through that process. I'm still not sure if I'll use some of the blank frames with the natural blur, or if I'll use some of the blurring tools in Photoshop. Yep. Intensity, Cody. I still really want to try every approach that might make it work in camera. So my next attempt is going to use some lights to freeze Cody. Part of the problem was I was getting really nice kind of radial blurs in the background, but just matching the zoom with his speed wasn't going well. So the idea here is to use a strobe with like a short flash duration to freeze Cody for a split second. So there's still going to be some motion around him, but if I can keep the light beam centered enough on his face, hopefully it looks somewhat natural and that we get that kind of intensity in his face. I can already tell this isn't going to work.
Let's go.
All right, let's try it. I feel like we had it and like your face is already turning. That one's not bad, but like for some reason every time you're sharp, like the background, like. One more time, Cody. One more time.
You.
That's it. If this doesn't work, I know Photoshop. There's a reason I know Photoshop. Freeze you for a little bit, but there's still too much ambient light affecting you. All right, let me film this failure and then we're done. All right, still recording. Cody, set up, turn your bike around. Watch the light behind you.
Oh, lots of room. Frank's worked me to the bone.
So using the lights to try and freeze them, also failure in all honesty. So part of the problem was we still want some of the background stuff showing. So there was just too much ambient light affecting him. So I'll show some of the frames as I've tried these various things. I'm going back to what I know, and that's Photoshop. So we'll see if we can make it look good there. And if there's any other photographers that have advice on how I can make it work in camera, I'd love to hear. That's that. Please like and subscribe. Alright, back in the office, just uploading all the photos of Cody. Sorry for the lower quality production of this video. I'm trying to put out videos more often, so I'm trying and testing a bit more of a candid vlog style. Let me know what you think in the comments. I definitely miss my videographer, Jackie. You'll notice some of the shots are a little out of focus, and it's just a lot to manage trying to shoot while also filming the behind the scenes stuff. But did what I could. So I'm going through the photos now. I'll switch over to my screen sharing video and kind of go through what we've captured. All right, so I've uploaded all the photos here to Lightroom. I'm just gonna start scrolling through and show you kind of my thought process in relation to the video and the different techniques that I tried. So the first few shots here, nothing special. You'll notice here that my shutter speed was still way too fast to get any sort of dramatic blur. So looking over here in the information, I was at 1/40th of a second. So here you can start seeing the beginnings of the effect that I want, but not nearly dramatic enough. And if I zoom in, he's still relatively blurred out here, but getting kind of close to what I'm looking for. So the first set of photos here was taken with my 24-70, and part of the issue was it wasn't nearly intimate enough for the type of shot that I wanted, so I switched over to my 70-200, and you'll notice here the crop is just a lot more interesting. Part of the issue here that took me a while to kind of adjust for was the composition. The way zooming the lens kind of affects the blur, it's more dramatic on the outside of the frame and less noticeable on in the center. So my composition here really isn't ideal. I should have had Cody's face much more in the center. With this long of a lens, it took us a little while to adjust kind of the positioning to make it work. But even in the later shots, even though I knew my final photo, I didn't want Cody's face right in the center. I wanted a bit more of an interesting composition. I should have probably adjusted for it in camera and then just cropped it later to the final composition that I wanted. But you'll notice that later as I kind of scroll through these. So again, not really getting what I'm after, still probably way too fast for the shutter speed. So here I've adjusted the shutter to 1/25th of a second. And I just had Cody static and was kind of playing with how much blur I was getting with the zoom. So this actually kind of shows you the general look that I'm after, but wanted him moving and probably a little bit more blur on the sides. So here I'm still kind of testing it. So here the blur isn't bad, and Cody's relatively centered. So it's unfortunate that these ones didn't work out. It looks like my focus was maybe a little off, but I think the biggest problem was probably just not matching his speed with the zoom speed well enough. So we did a lot of these runs, just a lot of shots that didn't really work out. So here I dropped the shutter dramatically to 1/6 of a second. And this is the clean plate that I was showing in the behind the scenes video. This is kind of the feel that I'm after, really dramatic sense of motion blur. So trying that with Cody, obviously very challenging with that slower shutter to get him at all sharp. But going back to this shot here, there's actually something quite interesting about this shot. Even though he's not fully centered, I like how intense the movement is down here with the bike. So this is something that I marked for consideration later to maybe Photoshop together. So this one here, very cool feel. Unfortunately, the composition wasn't quite right with Cody's face in the center. So I'm going to skip over these next two here. I did play around with some editing already, but I'll kind of come back to those. This was the shot that I used as a base for just kind of like experimental test that I did. There was a number of things I liked about this shot. Obviously, his face isn't sharp at all, but the fact that he's already kind of leaning to the side to get out of his straight path kind of makes the shot a little bit more dynamic and interesting. There's a little bit more tension to this one rather than him riding completely straight towards the camera. So there's some opportunity, I think, to use this shot and composite some of the sharp kind of features of his face. So kind of just moving along, obviously nothing quite what I'm after. This is kind of getting there, but his face just really isn't sharp enough. Again, made the mistake of really not centering his face. I'm starting to think the more I look at these shots, I don't quite know if what I had in my head was really possible in camera, because I didn't quite want his face right in the center of the frame. And that's where using like Photoshop's blur or radial blur features might actually be a better solution for this sort of project, and we'll kind of go over that. So I'll just quickly kind of move through these. So here you'll notice that his face is actually quite sharp, 1/13 of a second, but just not nearly enough blur on the sides for what I'm after. This here I'll mark as well as a potential candidate for compositing. If we took this frame and composite onto the background with the intense blur, we probably have to blur his body a little bit to make it look natural, but a lot of potential with this shot. So just really more of the same. You can tell I was kind of starting to get frustrated here. Drop the shutter down again because this series here just did not seem to have enough blur. Sorry, moving back and forth there. So this is kind of the level of blur that I'm after, but again, just nothing sharp as far as the rider goes. So here again, one that I found very interesting, a bit of a wider shot, and you'll notice here we kind of get the effect that we're after. Again, just not really positioned properly, but again, one that might have future potential for compositing. So this is where I realized if I was going to get this to work, I really needed to position him in the center. Instantly you can tell that the composition really isn't as interesting. I can always crop after the fact. So this is probably the closest we got in camera. You'll notice I've kind of brightened the shot a little bit. I'll kind of go back to what it looked like straight out of camera. I was just kind of playing with it, but this is probably the closest we got to what I like envisioned in my head. Really still, I guess he's kind of sharp enough for the look that I'm after. But there just really wasn't enough interest in this shot for me. Even if I zoom in and kind of crop it into a slightly more interesting composition, it's okay, but it still just kind of seems a little flat. There's not really enough intensity in his face. and just wasn't really working for me, but worth editing and kind of seeing how it looks after a bit of retouching. So here's where I switch my settings over to capture him, or actually freeze him in the shot. So here I'm shooting at 1/400th of a second. So it was at this point that I realized I probably wasn't going to get the exact frame I was after in camera. So I wanted some clean photos just to give me as much flexibility as possible for the final composite. Just kind of scrolling through. So not a whole lot to see here. They're all sharp. The Canon EOS R5 does a really good job with face tracking, or just kind of tracking in general. So these all look fine. Cody's face was maybe a little more pouty than intense. So we had him switch it up a bit later on in the shots. But these again can provide good reference material. I'll skip over the next couple shots here because again I did a little experimenting, but I'll go through those tests live. So just quickly gonna go through these. So you'll notice here that I've marked a couple that I feel like have potential for compositing later. Obviously his face is a little underexposed. There's a lot of shadow from the helmet. But obviously all of that's easily fixable. So here I was testing the strobe. I was very determined to try and at least get the frame in camera. So as I mentioned in the video, what you can often do is mix a slow shutter with a flash or a strobe that has like a very quick flash duration. And what that'll do is it'll freeze a section of the frame. So here I was just testing the light and getting it all set up. So you'll notice once it gets a bit closer to the light, this actually isn't too bad, but again, just not nearly enough radial blur on the sides. But here you can kind of see what the light does. And unfortunately, I didn't have an extension arm with me to really place the light center on the path. So you'll notice here he's already kind of turning off of the path, and you've got all the motion blur associated with the movement in the lens. But where the light from the strobe hit him, kind of froze that section of his face. Again, if we were to do this properly, we probably would have needed the light right in the center and a bit lower. And I just didn't have the stands with me to do that properly. But that'll come into play later when I talk about some of the composites that I did. So here you can see it as well. Kind of a unique look, but not what I was after. So this is getting near the end of the shoot. So I grabbed a couple more clean plates and just a couple final shots. And it was at this point I realized I just wasn't going to get the look that I was after. But again, just to reiterate as I go through some of the edits that I did, some of the compositions that I assembled aren't really true to what would be able to be captured in camera. But I just want to highlight how a strobe could actually make some of those shots possible. So again, here you'll notice how everything is blurred, but where the short flash duration of the strobe is freezing a section of his face. So this is kind of the inspiration for the first experimental composition that I did. So I'll get rid of all the junk photos here and just kind of go back to the ones that I highlighted. So this one here probably stuck out to me the most as having kind of the energy that I was after. So what I ended up doing is trying to find a photo that kind of matched this look, where Cody's already kind of looking off frame, and had a bunch of options available from the shots where he's completely frozen. I kind of still wanted to be able to incorporate a little bit of blur. So what I ended up doing was grabbing one of the ones shot with the light. So we had a couple here where his face is turned a little bit. So it's one of these ones that I ended up using as the source for his face, my final composition. My apologies for the difference in kind of white balance and stuff. I was playing around with these and some have the flash and some don't. But kind of zooming in, I wanted a shot where his face still had a little bit of blur to it. So you'll notice that here. And I didn't want intense ghosting around the eyes. So I think it was actually probably this one that I ended up using. So I ended up having to flip the photo just because of the direction that he was faced in this shot over here. So I'll show you where I ended up and kind of go through how I got there. So this is probably what I'll end up using as my final image. I'm still not sure if I'll go with the more contrasty, saturated version or this one here, where most of the color is on Cody's face and kind of draws you in that way. This one probably looks a little bit more cohesive, but just seemed a little too dark. I feel like the shot looks really cool when it's viewed large. Unfortunately, as you view it smaller, it just kind of loses some of its impact. And I just found kind of the outside here, especially at smaller scales, just seemed a little too dark. But I'll open up the Photoshop file and go through how I got to this point. So this is my Photoshop file. You'll notice it's a little darker than the final image I showed you. I did a couple of final edits in Lightroom, but I'll go through my layers here. This was the original image that I imported. I adjusted some of the brightness and contrast and things like that in Lightroom before I brought it in. Then I ended up finding the image of Cody's face that I wanted to use. So I actually brought in two. This first one here, I had some issues with this kind of ghosting of his pupil and iris here. Just kind of how the strobe hit him. I didn't like that aspect of it. I did like how this one was actually a little bit more blurred, but I ended up using this frame here. It also had slightly more intensity and the kind of ghosting of the eye. The ghosting of the eye was a little higher, so it didn't overlap with the whites of the eye, and I found it a little less distracting. So before I go any further, as soon as I kind of dropped this in and masked out some of the outside of the face, I wasn't sure if I was going to move forward with it. I liked the energy and kind of tension of not having his face right in the center of the blur. But as I mentioned earlier, you couldn't actually capture this in camera without artificial light. So I was worried that the final piece was going to look a little too fake. But my argument for moving forward with it is like you could capture something like this by having that strobe capture and freeze his face. This probably doesn't have as much ghosting as one capture in camera to have, but you might be able to achieve a similar sort of result by using, if you use a rear curtain sync approach, where the flash went off near the end of the exposure. Anyways, I decided it was at least worth kind of moving forward with and seeing what we got as a final result. So I started doing a little editing here. So the bottom of his eyes were a little too dark for my liking, so I brightened those. Did a little contour into his face, and then started kind of playing with exposure, adding a bit of a vignette on the outside, a little bit more dodge and burn, and small little corrections. So here what I ended up doing, flattening the image and bringing this into the camera raw filter, and just boosting up the clarity and a couple of things, and a few final little retouches here. I ended up adjusting some of these hard lines, which just look very unnatural. They were part of the image. I'm not sure why a couple of these were sharp. But anyways, so I just ended up softening those a little bit so it looked a little bit more natural. And kind of final vignette. Knowing that I was going to make a couple final adjustments in Lightroom, this is kind of where I left it in Photoshop, saved, and then kind of went back to my final shot in Lightroom. Going over the development panel here, what I ended up doing was, I don't use presets very often, but ColorMade does make a set called Warm Petals that I quite like, and I really like how it impacts skin tones and greens, so it worked quite well for a shot like this. So I ended up using something like Warm Petals Light and making some of my own adjustments, so it's a little too intense for me. Anyways, this is where I ended up with the final image. I think I'll experiment with a couple of these others that might look a little bit more natural, where Cody is centered. Maybe something like this, composited with one of those blank frames. Actually, probably need them even more centered, something like this, just to kind of compare and have some options. I thought it might be interesting to explore some of the shots that I took during the last mountain biking video that inspired this shoot. As you'll see here, my model Jude's was getting ready at kind of the starting point of this shoot, and I was experimenting with my shutter speed and seeing what the actual radial blur looked like. As she starts riding, you'll notice that none of the shots even get remotely close to the look that we're after. You can kind of see here with her tire and the position that it's at, she was actually kind of coming uphill here, and as I'm following her, you'll notice that the radial blur, or just the blur in general, is a lot more kind of upward motion than radial. And as she moves, I'm following her, it kind of goes all over the place. So we did have the strobe on her, and you'll notice here some of that ghosting and mixed with like the sharp lines of where the strobe hit her. But yeah, just nowhere close to what I envisioned in my head. So I gave up pretty early during this shoot, just because that wasn't kind of the priority, and realized that with the conditions we were shooting in, this was just not going to happen. So a lot of people might be asking, why wouldn't you just shoot your image sharp and use Photoshop's radial blur tool? Which is a valid point. So I'll show you how easy that is. I'll find another shot here. So to show you what that feature would have done, I've picked one of the sharp shots that we captured in the same setting. She's got kind of a nice expression here. This one's already had some of the color grading applied to it from my final set of images. So I'll open up this in Photoshop. And what I'll probably do is actually start by cropping it a little bit to at least center her face. Just because I think it would look a little awkward to have her off to the side quite that much. So maybe something like this. I do want some of the environment. So I'll zoom out and I'll just kind of stretch out that background since it's going to be blurred anyways. So if this was going to be a static image, I'd take a little bit more care to do that in a less destructive way. But since we're blurring the outside, it doesn't really matter that much. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer here. And I will go into Photoshop, Blur, Radial Blur. And after you see how easy this is, some of you might be questioning why I spent so much time trying to capture this in camera. But I'll kind of compare this with the shot with Cody and explain why I bothered. So I might have to move the blur up a little bit, the center point, so you can see it's maybe a little low for what we're trying to do. So I'll try that again, blur, radial blur, and move this up even further. And I think I probably want the outside blurred even a bit further, so I'll crank this amount up to 30, and we want to zoom here. So, okay. So maybe the mount's a little much. We're losing kind of the shape of the bike down here. Just undo that. Blur, radial blur. Let's go back to 20, hit OK. So I feel like our positioning here is pretty good. And one of the benefits of doing this in Photoshop, you'll notice that the effect kind of has the same limitations as actually doing it in camera, where the point that's sharp is really, really small. You'll notice even on the sides here, this is obviously the center, so we're a little off, and also we start getting the radial blur happening too fast. But the benefit of doing this in Photoshop is you can easily bring your sharp layer back on top and mask it how you want. What I'll do here is just grab the gradient tool with the radial fill selected and kind of drag over her face in the mask over here. Sorry, we need white selected. Again. And as you can see, we have limitless control over which part of the image has a blur affected and doesn't have it affected. So really not a terrible result. If I was to shoot this again with this in mind, I probably would have wanted a bit of foliage or some of like the environment in the foreground, just to give it a little bit more context. And you'll notice that the final image that I edited of Cody does have that. I feel like kind of makes it a little bit more interesting. But But obviously, very easy way to do it is using Photoshop's radial blur tool. And you could modify this and spend a lot of time kind of retouching it to make it look a little bit more natural, but not bad for the final image. Actually, I might even reduce the blur a little bit more if I was to kind of finish this up, but not a bad result, and obviously a lot easier than the effort I went to with Cody's shoot. So I'll close this. I guess I'll save it as a separate file. All right, back over here in Cody's gallery, and I kind of want to demonstrate what I just mentioned about wanting some more like foliage and parts of the environment on the side here. And part of, I guess, the issue with with the ones that I shot of Jude's were they were all vertical. So most of the interest in terms of the radial blur is going to be above and below her. So there's not a whole lot of environment there. Here we've got some nice kind of bushes on the sides that kind of surround Cody. So we'll try that same effect here and see how it compares. So same process, just going to open it up in Photoshop. So this one here obviously was shot with a little bit more care taken to have Cody's face right in the center. So this one's actually going to be really easy as far as using Photoshop's radial blur tool. I'm just going to duplicate this, go back to filter, blur, radial blur, make sure zoom is selected. Actually bring our blur center back to the center. Let's try 20, okay. So you'll notice here we're a little off, so I'll just redo that and adjust one more time. And I'm going to crank this up a little bit, okay? So we're pretty close to the center of his face. Same sort of issues before. The blur starts applying way too close to the center, so we lose the eyes and stuff. But as I mentioned, just take one of the sharp layers, bring it over top, and same sort of approach, mask it using the radial gradient tool. His face is sharp. And this really is kind of the look that I was after. And we captured one that I showed earlier that was pretty close to this. To me, it's just not as interesting of a shot as I had in mind, partially because of the crop and also the expression. So what I'll do is kind of play with this a little further. I think if we did another version of the blur and really emphasize it here on the sides, let's do the exact same thing, just run the radial blur again. So here, obviously, super, super intense. We start kind of losing the shape of the bike and almost makes you a little dizzy to look at. So what I'll do is kind of similar process earlier. I'll add a mask, and then just use the radial gradient tool just to mask out the center here. And I might actually use the levels adjustment to make that transition a little harsher. I might have to actually even scale it up just a bit. So you can see it with and without, just kind of emphasizes the side here. And then from here on out, obviously you could go into a lot more detail with retouching and color grading. I did a little bit of this and also recropped it, and here you can kind of see the final result. Really not terrible. I'd probably do a couple more things to kind of think his face. But part of my issue with this approach is that it just doesn't quite have the energy and tension that I'm after. It's just too straight on, too symmetrical. So I did end up coming back to this shot over and over again. There was just something about the movement of this that I found so much more interesting. And also actually capturing the blur in camera, you'll notice that it's not quite as perfect. There's these like little like jitters in the lines, and also down here where there's other movement happening, such as on like the y-axis here, and with Cody turning. Not all of the motion blur is attributed to just the radial blur. We've got some back and forth stuff happening here. And to me, it just looks a little bit more interesting, dynamic. Even having the rider kind of overlapping the center of where the blur is happening, and then sharpening his face. Even though it's less true to life, there's something about it that I think is almost more eye-catching. So going back to the edits that I already did, looking at this, one thing I might adjust is I might actually blur his face a little on the sides and maybe by the mouth and stuff, and just keep the eyes sharp. It looks a little too sharp, as if it was just Photoshopped, which obviously it was. But just to integrate it into this background a little more. That's maybe a final adjustment that I'll make. After all that experimentation, I think this is the final that I've actually landed on. So actually going back a couple stages, I feel that the amount of ghosting here actually matches the face a lot better than some of the newer versions that I tried. So I think this is it. It's a wrap on this kind of really drawn out project for a single image. I didn't mean for this video to be so long, but I thought it was kind of interesting to actually leave some of the thought process involved in creating an image like this, especially one that's a little bit more experimental in nature. And oftentimes when I watch YouTube videos of people doing cool stuff, it's straight from kind of concept, execution, final product, and you don't see a lot of this kind of testing that goes on, as well as failures, which are part of being a photographer or really any creative. As soon as you stop failing, you kind of stop growing. So I'm pretty happy with this final result. And even though I wasn't able to capture it fully in camera as I had hoped, that is why other tools exist. So sometimes you need to combine various techniques and tools at your disposal to create the image that you have in your head. So all in all, I'm pretty happy with it. And let me know what you think of this kind of more candid, different style of video format where I kind of talk through the process of actually executing an image. I know it's probably a bit more of a niche market that's into this sort of thing, but if enough people are into it, I'll do a couple more of these.